Hi, good evening. Good evening, hello. My name's Mark Storsley. I'm the Executive Director of the Constitutional Law Center, and as Michael McConnell, the Director of the Con Law Center, couldn't be with us tonight. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you here for our conversation with Professor John Inazu. Professor Inazu's work is widely known and has been widely praised among legal scholars and as a regular contributor to public discourse more generally. Professor Inazu is, I think, doing a lot to ask deeper questions about the meaning of the First Amendment and its relationship to public culture. The questions are in some ways quite old. I think anybody who's taken First Amendment or maybe just shown an interest in some of these issues about difference, disagreement, pluralism. One of the first things that comes to mind is the Supreme Court's famous decision in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. For those of you not familiar with that decision, it's one of the, I think, landmark Supreme Court decisions of the 20th century where the Supreme Court said that there was a constitutional right for students to abstain from saying the Pledge of Allegiance, that nobody can be forced to speak truths that they don't believe in. Central to that, the court said, I think some pretty memorable words. They said, "We apply the limitations of the Constitution with no fear that freedom to be intellectually and spiritually diverse or even contrary will disintegrate the social organization." The idea being, we're not afraid of difference and disagreement in our culture. In fact, that maybe is the thing that makes our culture distinct. Professor Inazu, in his work, explores that question, and I think that set of issues, and really is encouraging us to think not just about what kind of First Amendment we want to have, but sort of what kind of people we want to be and what kind of virtues we need to maintain the constitutional order that we have. So his first book, Liberty's Refuge, explored those questions by reclaiming what he calls the forgotten freedom of assembly, a right enumerated in our First Amendment but rarely talked about among courts and commentators. His second book, Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference, is the topic of his conversation tonight. As I mentioned, Professor Inazu is widely known among legal scholars for his First Amendment scholarship and has been a prominent contributor to the national debate on a variety of issues, regularly publishing not just in law reviews, but also in newspapers and popular publications. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Inazu.
Well, thanks. It's great to be with you tonight. I was puzzling as Mark was talking over the no food allowed in the classroom sign. I guess that's negated when you have beer, too. It's great to be with you to talk about confident pluralism. I'm going to talk for probably about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A about the issues I raise. I want to start, though, with the bleak but uncontroversial premise that we have deep and irreconcilable differences in our society that are not likely to be overcome. On this Election Day Eve, think about the deep fractures emerging out of the current political season, the inability to find common ground that pushes many of our fellow citizens toward more extreme positions. Think about your own visceral reaction, positive or negative, to words like evangelical, Black Lives Matter, conservative, progressive, Muslim, atheist. We Americans like to talk about unity. We see ourselves as one nation, indivisible, and in pursuit of a more perfect union. But much of our actual existence is characterized more by difference and disagreement than it is by unity. We lack agreement about the purpose and direction of our country, about the nature of the common good, and about the meaning of human flourishing. These differences pervade our backgrounds, tastes, and allegiances. We've even come to have cultural symbols about these divides: red states and blue states, Fox News and MSNBC, Whole Foods and Chick-fil-A. These differences affect not only what we think, but how we think and how we see the world. The philosopher John Rawls famously called it the fact of pluralism. Our differences are not going away. We're stuck with the good, the bad, and the ugly of pluralism. And that leaves us with a practical problem in need of a political solution. Rousseau proposed one answer to that problem. He wrote, "It is impossible for men to live in peace with those they think are damned." Confident pluralism insists that Rousseau was wrong, that our shared existence is not only possible but also necessary. And instead of the elusive goal of unity, confident pluralism suggests a more modest possibility that we can live together in our manyness. That's a vision that does not entail illusions that our differences will disappear. To the contrary, it forces us to pursue a common existence in spite of our deeply held differences. Confident pluralism takes confidence and pluralism seriously. Confidence without pluralism misses the reality of politics. It suppresses difference, sometimes violently. Pluralism without confidence misses the reality of people. It ignores or trivializes difference for the sake of feigned agreement and false unity. Confident pluralism allows genuine difference to coexist without suppressing or minimizing our firmly held convictions. The goal is not to settle which views are right and which are wrong. Instead, confident pluralism proposes that the future of our democratic experiment requires finding a way for us to be steadfast in our personal convictions while also making room for others to disagree. Instead of shutting down or shutting out those with whom we disagree, confident pluralism suggests we allow for meaningful space to differ, and with it, the opportunity for mutual persuasion. Confident pluralism includes both a legal and a personal dimension. The two are interrelated. The inclination to shut a certain viewpoint outside the bounds of civil society begins with personal antipathy, but it ends with legal prohibition, a refusal to extend the protections of the law to one's adversaries, and ultimately an effort to turn the law against them. Our human nature and our own history make clear that despite our best intentions, we all too easily embrace these tendencies when we grasp power. How then to guard against these impulses? Well, let's begin with two aspects of the constitutional argument for confident pluralism: the right of association and the public forum. Both of these doctrines should exist to protect meaningful spaces for difference and dissent, but both are deeply distorted in their current forms. Start with the right of association, or what the Supreme Court calls expressive association, first recognized just over 30 years ago. The basic idea underlying associational autonomy is that the private groups that we form in civil society are important spaces properly free from government interference, absent an extraordinarily compelling justification. The right of association and expressive association does not adequately protect this space in civil society. Instead of tying groups to the formation of beliefs, values, and identity, expressive association focuses only on the outwardly expressive dimensions of groups, hence the name expressive association. And this should be odd to us. Each of us knows from our own experiences that the groups we form are far more than simply expressive. We find meaning and value and belonging. We learn by sharing ideas and experiences inside of our groups, and we make bonds through informal interactions. Focusing only on the outward expression of groups misses the inherent connection between a group's existence, its practices, and its message. The right of expressive association also creates an artificial distinction between groups that are expressive and groups that are purportedly non-expressive. Non-expressive groups receive no constitutional protection from government interference. But that artificial distinction misses the fact that all associative acts have expressive potential. Joining, gathering, speaking, and not speaking can all be expressive. Take the example of the Top Hatters Motorcycle Club, a California biker group founded by brothers Jess and Joe Bravo in 1947. In July of 2000, 4 members of the Top Hatters rode to the Gilroy Garlic Festival in Gilroy, California, just about an hour southeast of us. For those of you who may not know, Gilroy is the garlic capital of the world, so a festival is not entirely unsurprising. The Top Hatters arrived wearing leather and denim vests bearing the club's insignia, a skull with wings wearing a top hat. The Gilroy police determined that these were gang colors and denied the Top Hatters entrance to the festival. All of this led to a federal lawsuit with lots of issues, but for our purposes, the most important fact from the litigation is that the Top Hatters were held to be a non-expressive association and therefore had no right on which they could base their claim. That should puzzle us. The group states that its number one priority is rioting and strengthening the brotherhood in the biker community. Their core values are maintaining a strong group states that it's not strong social gatherings, charitable events, and other shared endeavors. Is it meaningful or reasonable to conclude that none of these activities is sufficiently expressive? The challenges are even more difficult once we consider the online implications of the expressive versus non-expressive divide. Websites, like the Top Hatters' own website, blogs, and other online forums are unquestionably expressive. Today's courts have not begun to account for these expressive dimensions of groups. The right of expressive association and its lack of constitutional protections weakens and obscures the vision for the voluntary groups of civil society. Without stronger protections for these groups, we will not have the possibility of confident pluralism. The second legal doctrine important to confident pluralism is the public forum. This is a constitutional protection for the space to voice dissent in government-provided spaces, the physical and virtual spaces where citizens come together to voice opposition, discontent, and expression. Public forums can be actual places, like town halls or city parks, but they can also be non-physical spaces, like the forums of student organizations on public college and university campuses. Public forums are essential to our democratic experiment. They provide a practical mechanism for citizens to gather, express, and engage on topics and issues of their choosing in their own ways and on their own terms. This ideal of the public forum represents one of the most important aspects of a healthy democracy. It signifies a willingness to tolerate dissent, discomfort, and even instability. These intuitive connections were not lost on the writers of one of my favorite television shows, Parks and Recreation. In one season from episode 2, a delegation from a municipal Parks and Recreation department in Venezuela visits the fictional town of Pawnee, Indiana. The delegation's leader, Raul, expresses dismay upon observing a public forum in the United States. "This is outrageous. Where are the armed men who come to take the protesters away? This kind of behavior is never tolerated where I'm from. You shout like that, they put you in jail right away. No trial, no nothing. Journalists, we have a special place for journalists." And yet we aren't as far away from Raul's vision as we might like to believe. The suppression of public outrage in Ferguson, Missouri in the immediate aftermath of Michael Brown's death, to include the arrest of journalists who covered the protests, is only one example of the ongoing violations of the public forum in this country. And these violations reach across the political spectrum. Under current law, political protesters in public forums are often relegated to physically distant and ironically named free speech zones. Labor picketers confront oppressive restrictions in public areas. Churches are prohibited from renting generally available public facilities. Occupy protesters in New York City parks, anti-abortion protesters on Colorado sidewalks, and political protesters in the North Carolina Capitol have all been silenced by government officials overreaching their authority. The public forum in practice is quite unrecognizable from its ideal, and that departure should give us great pause. Strengthening the associational protections for groups and reclaiming the public forum are two of the essential constitutional aspects of confident pluralism. We must insist that the people we entrust to govern us honor basic constitutional principles that protect difference and dissent. But confident pluralism also depends on us and the everyday decisions we make without the constraints of law, and what we say and how we interact with others. The shortcomings of our own civic practices, and there are many shortcomings, are ours to overcome. Confident pluralism builds upon three aspirations to improve our civic practices: tolerance, humility, and patience. Now, these three words are not self-evidently confident. We might think of them as concessions or compromises. It could seem less obvious that we would pursue tolerance, humility, and patience in light of our firmly held convictions. But it is, in fact, the confidence in our own beliefs in the midst of deep difference that allows us, or should allow us, to engage charitably with others. Instead of lashing out at others or remaining in our own echo chambers, we can pursue dialogue and coexistence even when, and perhaps especially when, we believe that our views are the better ones. So let me spend just a few minutes unpacking these three aspirations. Tolerance is the recognition that people are, for the most part, free to pursue their own beliefs and practices, even those beliefs and practices that we find morally objectionable. This is no small task. As one philosopher has observed, the basic difficulty of tolerance is that we need it only for the intolerable. But tolerance does not require embracing all beliefs and viewpoints as good or right. Instead of an anything-goes, happy-go-lucky tolerance, we can embrace a practical enduring of difference for the sake of coexistence. Parsing this difference between tolerance and approval requires the hard work of remembering the difference between people and ideas. Tolerance asks that we treat people with respect. It doesn't mean we respect all ideas. Every one of us holds ideas that others find unpersuasive, inconsistent, or illogical. And every one of us holds ideas that others find morally reprehensible. The tolerance of confident pluralism does not impose the fiction that all ideas are equally valid or harmless. It does mean respecting people, aiming for fair discussion, and allowing for the space to differ about serious matters. Humility takes us a step further. In recognizing that other people will sometimes find our beliefs and practices objectionable, we must also realize that we can't always prove why we are right and they are wrong. Put differently, humility recognizes that some of our most deeply held beliefs stem from contested premises that others do not share. This humility that I'm describing is based on the limits of what we can prove, not on claims about what is ultimately true. For this reason, it should not be mistaken as relativism. Humility leaves open the possibility that there is right and wrong and good and evil. Our beliefs can be true, and we can also know those beliefs. We know lots of things we can't prove. We know what we ate for breakfast last week, or at least some of us remember that. We know that we are loved and sometimes that we are not loved. We know that the sun will rise tomorrow. This kind of knowledge also extends to our moral beliefs. We know that burning someone alive is bad and helping a vulnerable child is good. And many of us are confident about more contested moral beliefs. We hold these beliefs even though some people reject them. Finally, patience. Patience points toward restraint, persistence, and endurance. It encourages efforts to listen, understand, and empathize, but we need not accept or affirm as we do so. And in fact, it might turn out that patient listening leads us to a deeper realization of the error of another viewpoint. But we can at least assume a posture that leaves open a different possibility that moves beyond caricatured dismissals of others before we even hear what they have to say. Tolerance, humility, and patience can facilitate creative partnerships across difference. This kind of bridge building may not overcome ideological difference. We are, after all, unlikely to find agreement on all of the difficult issues that divide us. But we can begin to build relational difference. We can find common ground even when we don't agree on a common good. Finding common ground begins with acknowledging the reality of our differences. Without the ability or the avenues to air real disagreements, genuine dialogue occurs less frequently and our assumptions go unchallenged. Tolerance becomes a demand for acceptance, humility is supplanted by moral certainty, and patience loses to outrage. I worry that our failure to practice genuine dialogue across real differences will ultimately deprive us of our capacity to do so. We see this in a range of issues, but perhaps none as heated today as race. People in this country are deeply split about the causes and solutions to our racial challenges, and in some cases, whether those challenges even exist. In the midst of our differences, we also confront a crisis of authority that feels relatively new. The weakening of major institutions across politics, education, the media, and religion, the demise of truly national leaders in any of these sectors, and the rise of social media have all contributed to this crisis of authority. The fracturing of authority in institutions poses significant obstacles to attaining what I have called a modest unity, the minimal amount of consensus and sense of belonging that we, the people of this country, need in order to make confident pluralism possible. So is there any place for hope in these circumstances? Well, some people have accused me of a kind of naive optimism in confident pluralism. One reviewer, who was otherwise fairly positive about my book, nevertheless argued that it was, quote, doomed to immediate irrelevance because it lacked an audience that would respond to it. I don't think that's right. I hope not, at least. Despite the many challenges ahead, I do remain hopeful. And one reason is that the American experiment, for all of its failures and shortcomings, has actually worked for much of our nation's history. This is not the first time that we have confronted racial tensions, divergent views of morality, religious difference, and coarse rhetoric. In many ways, the success of the American political experiment has always required finding and maintaining a modest unity against great odds. We also have a lot of smart and caring people in this country. This national election season has not highlighted our best. But we ought not to forget that there are a great number of people doing good in the everyday happenings outside of the spotlight. And we need to tell each other stories of this good, the stories that harness our collective imagination toward a shared future. One of the challenges that we confront in imagining a shared future is that some people are still looking only to the past. Yuval Levin's important book, The Fractured Republic, describes a deep nostalgia from both left and right that longs for a bygone era, albeit different eras for each side, in which the world seemed to work better. Of course, many people in this country are not interested in any kind of retrieval project. Going back to the good old days is not a good bet if your race, gender, religion, or sexuality placed you outside of the political consensus that ruled those times. This tension between those who long for the past and those who have happily transcended it is one of the inherent tensions of a pluralistic society. The more we recognize the actual differences among us, the less consensus we are able to assume. But this diversity of groups and ideas comes with a tremendous upside. It offers the possibility of better and more creative solutions from working across difference and of navigating the challenges of pluralism without succumbing to the despair that leads to chaos or the fear that leads to control. This is, in the end, a relatively modest vision, but it is an important one. Confident pluralism does not give us the American dream, but it could help avoid the American nightmare. And for that possibility, we cannot lose hope. Thank you again for the invitation to join you, and I look forward to the questions to follow.
Is this on? Great. Okay, so we had some complaints last time from people not being able to hear. So if you have a question, just indicate to me. I'd be happy to just pass the mic over to anybody who wants to ask a question.
Thank you so much for a great overview of what you were talking about with confident pluralism. And I wanted to ask you how you apply that to the concept when someone else's belief might threaten your safety. And I'm specifically talking about guns in this country, the Second Amendment. I want to respect other people's amendment, but I also feel that that by them owning a gun, it puts my safety at risk. So I'm curious to know how you might apply something like confident pluralism to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So some of our disagreement is going to, and the hardest kinds of disagreement are going to bring us to these zero-sum kinds of issues. I think the way I started to approach these questions is what I talked about briefly in the talk about a modest unity, the idea that we have to have some level of consensus that brings us together. And in the book I discuss, we need sort of, at a minimal, a kind of equality of opportunity that includes a public safety as well. So it doesn't make any sense to have a discussion about navigating our differences if the people down the street don't have adequate safety or health care or education. And so in almost a Rawlsian kind of sense, we do need a baseline safety. Now, how that works out, particularly with a discrete policy question like gun control, I don't have specifics off the top of my head, but I think it falls into that category of important issues where if we're going to have serious discussions about coexisting peacefully, we need to start with the premise that people are safe and have adequate resources. And I think we're actually far from that in a lot of places in our country.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned something about blue states and red states, and I wonder if pluralism and the animosities that are generated by differences force people to say, well, maybe I would really like to live in a blue state or in an area that has gun control, whereas the place I live in doesn't have the laws that are safe enough for me. And then you get this migration and separation of the people according to belief.
Yeah, so this challenge of federalism is a real puzzle for, I think, pluralism generally and the kinds of things I'm talking about, because in one sense it does actually make sense to delegate to lower levels of governmental authority a kind of like-mindedness or people clustering together. But on the other hand, the more you fracture by states and regions, the less of an overall consensus that we can assume. And I'll sort of double down on the pessimism here because I think social media only exacerbates this. I was a couple weeks ago doing a discussion with Nicholas Kristof in Manhattan, and Kristof shared this story that I had just sort of frightened me. There was a recent nonpartisan study of news sources, and the alt-left media, it found, just made up things 20% of the time, just empirically falsifiable claims about the state of the world, and the alt-right 40% of the time. And so when you think about some of our fellow citizens increasingly drawn to these polarized news sources, and Kristof's prediction is that the market response or the market drive of media is only going to make that worse in the coming years, we don't even have to think about our geographical divide because our cognitive existential divide based on our media sources is going to become increasingly incompatible. And I don't know how you move forward with that reality. It's a pretty scary one to think about.
Hi. So I can imagine a pluralism of tolerance or a pluralism of discourse. And you were talking a lot about the pluralism of discourse that's born of a certain modesty, balanced with confidence in one's belief. But the discourse, I'm assuming, is not simply strategic to make it look like we're conversing, but actual, as part of the marketplace of ideas, a hope that we'll educate each other and perhaps even change and transform each other. And I'm curious how that jibes with religious belief that is above a different plane than rationality. It's about belief, it's about faith, and not necessarily, therefore, amenable to discourse about, well, logically this or historically this. It's a matter of faith. So how do we get around that cycle of this is what I believe, and therefore we can talk to each other, but it's really just for the sake of symbolism. We're not going to change each other because this is founded in our core beliefs.
So two thoughts on that question. One is I think we want to blow up the category a little bit because a lot of commitments, religious or non-religious, are actually founded on a kind of faith that combines. Right? I mean, not all belief systems are utterly rational, and so I think when we talk to the people we actually encounter, whether they're religious or not, there are a whole lot of extra rational, deeply held emotive beliefs that are not going to likely be changed by a logical argument or rational discourse. On the other hand, when you look at the history of religious conversions in all directions, people do change religious beliefs, and often, I mean, we've got a lot of bad history there, right, with coerced conversions, but you have plenty of examples of voluntary coercion voluntary conversion that comes through a kind of relationship or dialogue over time, and really flowing in all directions. So I think many people are open, at least to the possibility of religious conversion and change of belief. And so I think part of it is engaging in an ongoing dialogue and a relationship. And once again, social media cuts against this, right? Because we actually don't often have relationships unfold in our social media interactions. And so we have to figure out ways to move more of this discussion offline and into relationships.
Thank you for what I felt as I was listening to you, an inspiring talk. And the past few questions have offered you opportunities to showcase how your concepts can find application. I'd like to offer an opportunity that you could actually, with your understanding of the challenges of the American society today, where this confident pluralism could gain traction, on some examples that you can give on some of the most pressing challenges that society faces today, rather than the specific instances that were offered, and perhaps your response was an acknowledgement of the challenge.
Sure. So I think I'm more optimistic of this on the local level than I am on the national level, and then I mean one of the reasons that the national conversation gets harder is the actual relationships in Washington are more and more diffuse and less frequent than they used to be. But on the local level, I actually am encouraged by stories I hear and stories I found. So I think many times when people face calamity or crisis on the local level, you find out that you're actually responding together and forgetting about some of your differences, and you're actually just, putting the sandbags up or helping the people who are hurt. And so, and those are both in immediate crises, but also longer-term crises. And so when I think about the state of public education in St. Louis, where I'm from, and watching religious and non-religious people coming together in partnerships for tutoring and other kinds of engagements, I think we see this. Politics, when it happens on the local level, can often be for the good and help bridge these relationships. I'll give you one other concrete example. The current president of Focus on the Family, who's not James Dobson, so many people in this room probably know Focus on the Family as this religious right culture wars organization from the 80s and 90s. They have a new president who's working to change the tone, and they're headquartered in Colorado, and he called up the president of a gay rights foundation in Colorado, Ted Trempa of the Gill Foundation, and said, "I know we don't agree on a lot of stuff, but I think we both agree that underage sex trafficking in Colorado is a real problem right now. So why don't we combine our political resources and our constituents and go lobby the legislature for anti-sex trafficking legislation?" And they did, and the legislation passed. So there's, I think, a concrete example. Now, that doesn't mean they actually did become friends in that process. They didn't move the dial on their own beliefs over really painful and contested issues. And in many ways, those divergences of belief prevent a kind of deep friendship from ever manifesting on a certain level. But they maintained a friendship, and they actually worked together to find common ground that made a real difference in people's lives. And I think the more we look for those kinds of stories and then tell those stories, the better we're going to be seeing these possibilities.
I've been trying to figure out how to ask my question. It's about the idea of microaggressions, and I have Gerald Wing-Su's book, Microaggressions and Marginality. And so I thought maybe you could summarize. I have a son who just graduated from college at Pomona College, and I was struck by how idealistic, we want to solve the world's problems kids would go in and come out suspicious of basically every word that was spoken, in my mind. And I think a lot of it is because, in my mind, they're being indoctrinated to think that every word, every look is suspect, it's an attack, and I wonder, it seems to be the antithesis of what you're saying. I just wonder, you're familiar with this idea and how pervasive it is. Would you address how you see that, influencing the idea that there can be a dialogue or some kind of consensus or people working on problems together?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question, and I don't know the climate at Stanford, but speaking from Washington University, where I teach, this is very much an issue, particularly for the undergraduates. And I would add to the issue of microaggressions also questions about trigger warnings and safe spaces. And the challenge here is that there are actually really important arguments on both sides of these debates, and so I don't want to be dismissive in either direction. I think so. Take the concept of a safe space, for example. There's actually a real value to having something like a safe space in some settings, and it actually dovetails in very interesting ways with the right of association. And so this is an issue that should cut across ideological priors when you think about the underpinnings of some of those concepts. On the other hand, I do think that increasing speech norms and the policing of language is becoming a way that we stifle conversation. I see this in my students quite often, and increasingly so, and I think it's antithetical to what the university is supposed to be. So one of the things I talk about when it comes to free speech, I am a strong advocate of robust free speech norms, which means, and built into American free speech jurisprudence, is you get to say a lot of things that cause a lot of damage to other people. So you get to say things that are hateful and hurtful and cause emotional harm and psychological harm and reputational harm, and there are very few restrictions on that. And I think that when we, in public or private settings, come in and try to, particularly in the university, when we try to police the boundaries of speech norms, then we end up usually causing more harm than good. But then I also say, okay, so let's keep that as the legal baseline or even the policy baseline. Have a very open free speech norm. But then let's figure out how to talk to each other a little better. So just because we have the ability to say whatever we want doesn't mean we should. And so on the other hand, I look at some of the college campuses and the people who recognize their free speech norm and think that means they have to exercise it all the time. And so when you start to purposefully offend somebody, yes, you have the right to do so, but does that mean that that's the best way to live together? Are you even advancing your arguments in the best way if you choose to do so? And so I think what I worry about the current debates is they seem very heavy-handed and very almost paternalistic in the norms they're trying to enforce. And I think if we did a better job modeling norms and actually having follow-up conversations to say, let me tell you why that particular choice of words actually was offensive to me. You might not have realized it, but let me tell you why. And then hopefully start to build an internal societal norm where that works its way through. Now, will that happen? I don't know. I mean, it's going to take enough people to get on board with it, but I find that preferable to the top-down regulation of it.
Hey, I have a question about that connects social media and free speech nowadays. I feel like, nowadays, a lot of us, and I encountered it personally, we get some kind of information from social media about the people who we are in touch with, about, the political climate that might be, prevalent in our eyes. And then we get really, really surprised. Hopefully we won't, about, election results or about racial relationship or, all of those issues. And I wonder whether you think that, this idea of tribes, of people, going on in tribes, in a way, is more prominent nowadays? Or was it like the same? Or is it like, the same idea, just, more prominent because we see, we see it reflected in social media or the, maybe the gaps between neighborhoods and places we live and the places we work and the people we interact on the everyday basis. Did it change over the years?
Yeah, so I think we've always had these tribes and this tendency to cluster in tribes. I think social media has exacerbated it because you can find more like-minded people or seemingly like-minded people all around the country and the world. And then I also think city planning has also hurt our ability to engage with people across different. It used to be that you actually had something called the town square in cities, right? And people would cluster around there. And now, unless it's part of the prefab shopping mall that someone plants there, you don't have the town square, and it's harder in many places to find those natural points of interaction. And so we've got to work better at getting out of those clusters and those echo chambers. And I think we can do that in two ways. In the book, I talk about two examples, what I call the Dave principle and the Sandy principle. And the Dave principle I named after a guy who I had a piece about Ferguson, Missouri on CNN, and as soon as it went live, he wrote to me, and I think I'm forgetting the quote. It was something like, "Shut your pie hole or move your guilt-ridden ass to Ferguson," something like that. Something like a nice sort of warm engagement. And so what I think of when I think of the Dave principle, I think of just the idea that you immediately just shut down or a different view than yours, and you dismiss it or you critique it or you call it names. And then the Sandy principle I named after my mom, somewhat jokingly, but the thought experiment that if I just shared my drafts of my writing with my mom, she would always just say it's perfect and golden, right? Which is not a good way to engage. And so the Sandy principle, also bad, right? Don't just share your ideas with people who are going to agree with you. And so how can we work on our own practices of engaging more charitably, but also engaging and not sticking with our echo chambers? And I think so. One of the few bright spots of social media, I think, here is Twitter, because I think you can actually force yourself on Twitter to get feeds from all kinds of differing viewpoints. And so my own Twitter feed is set up this way. So anytime some national news story happens, I'm getting this range of perspectives, none of which can all be true, right? Because they're just mutually incompatible. But it makes me think, okay, there are actually people all around this country right now viewing this from wildly different perspectives. And that's helpful to think, well, there's probably, in many cases, some elements of truth to many of these perspectives, and maybe I ought to slow down and think about how I'm reacting to it as well.
So thank you for your timely and important work. My question is about, there's a proposition on the California ballot that will be decided tomorrow. I think it's Proposition 58 about bilingual education. And on one side, it seems the people see the main problem is that immigrants aren't learning English or they aren't learning it fast enough. And on the other side, people see the problem or the opportunity as kids aren't becoming bilingual. Let's make it easier for kids and families to raise bilingual children. So my question is, do you have any perspective on how these arguments might shape up in the coming decades?
Yeah, I'm doing my very best just to stay on top of Missouri politics, so I can't even start to think about California politics. Although I'll punt a little bit and just more broadly to your question to say that we do, and with increasing immigration trends and changing immigration trends, we're always going to have to reassess who is actually in our midst, right, and who forms the base of our populace. And that's how, we are going to misdescribe the pluralism around us unless we actually account for the people who are there. And that also means giving voice to lots of people. And I don't know the particular political mechanisms to do that here or elsewhere, but it's more of the descriptive point that if you don't allow for all voices to be heard, you actually don't have a robust pluralism. You just have an assumed consensus, and you have power plays. And again, not to say how that comes out on this issue, but that we ought to be striving for a better understanding of who the voices are. And we're going to be surprised by who some of those voices are, I think.
Are you able to help us understand the rise of political correctness over the last couple of years and how this fits into your dialogue?
Well, I take it, that question is partially related maybe to the microaggressions question earlier. So I think, I'm a bit mixed on the issue because I think that the phrase political correctness is, I think, way too often dismissed from some people on the right as just a lefty move without any content to it. And actually, we know just intuitively that the meaning of words and phrases changes over time. And so we ought to be attentive to those changes. And I mean, when you think about what were the racial slurs 50 years ago, I mean, I don't, some of these words I don't actually know, but many of them had to do with Eastern European immigration trends. And, and those are words that none of us, maybe very few of us here would recognize as racial slurs. So that's an example of something that changes over time. And so to dismiss, sometimes I worry that the political correctness label is just dismissive of all of that without recognizing that words and change meanings do real harm. And then on the other hand, I think it's important to have a conversation about some of these issues and language developments and not assume there can be a sanctimony from someone on the left about the meaning of words and again, like the social shaming that comes along with not saying the word correctly or not using the right label. And that's something that in the social media space today we see happen very rapidly. I'm thinking as we're talking about the Caitlyn Jenner Vanity Fair cover, right? And so, within 12 hours of that, if people were using the wrong pronoun, there was this huge stigma on social media. And I'm not sure, I think to try to have more of a back and forth about changed language can be helpful to all of us. But I guess I am maybe more worried about the blanket dismissal of political correctness than the presence of it. But this is a tricky balance because I see power plays in both directions.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed your speech as well, and I agree with you on a local level. I'm very optimistic. I am very concerned about Standing Rock, and I'm just curious, do you feel with all your extensive knowledge that there's some violations of freedoms? There was violence used against protesters. There was military force and dogs that were attacking protesters at Standing Rock.
Yeah, so I think on the policing of protests, I think we've got a long way to go in this country to allow for a greater expression of protest. And I say this as the brother of a police officer. And we've had long, not so confident pluralistic discussions about these issues. But they're very real, and I do understand to some extent a law enforcement perspective here. But there's a sense in which I think, even on a fundamental level of training and the rules of engagement under our laws, that we could rethink some of these things. I've just recently written a paper on the law of unlawful assembly, which polices these kinds of protest areas. And it's pretty striking how these laws have developed in states and local jurisdictions. They've become rather untethered from their origins in common law, and the knowledge and implementation of these laws is even worse. And so there was litigation after Ferguson in federal district court where the officers were subpoenaed and testifying, and they were asked on cross-examination, do you understand that the unlawful assembly provision in Missouri requires that a protester intend to violate the law with force or violence? That's a provision in the Missouri statute. And the officer said, no, we had no idea. Sorry about that. Right? Well, but these are the people making arrests and shutting down protests ostensibly based on what the statute is. So we have a real problem both in what the law is and how it's being implemented. And I think with better training and better attention to these laws, we could make some progress. On the other hand, when people start shooting with rifles at the police officers in Dallas, at some point the protest space just gets shut down, and you have to let law enforcement defend themselves and defend the people in the area. So I don't think that these are very hard questions. I don't have great answers to them, but I do worry that in the policy and legal setup, we haven't done a very careful job of the parameters. You're like a game show host, Mark.
I see this come up I think most often in the realm of religion, but I'm sure it happens with other ideologies too. But oftentimes it seems like in American discourse, at least, when you're trying to criticize the ideas underpinning the ideology, in this case religion, it gets taken as an attack on the person and shuts down all of the possibility for the tolerance, humility, and patience that you're talking about. So I wonder if you have thought through any strategies to help to separate out the ideology from the individual who holds them in terms of creating a better space to discuss this and creating more receptiveness to criticism on that basis.
Yeah, all of my strategies here are kind of third grade lessons, but get to know somebody first on the issues that you might have in common before. So when you meet someone for the first time, don't have the intense religious discussion, right? Or don't get into the discussion about race, but find out, hey, what's your name? And what do you like to do? And maybe figure out a relationship from within which to have those discussions. And then I think also, and this is not going to work all the time for everyone, but I do think we could all stand to have somewhat of thicker skins, right? If we're going to dive into hard conversations, then people are going to make missteps. They're going to say wrong things and offensive things, and kind of be in it with them, right? And be willing to have the follow-up question, and be willing to take some hits along the way. And I think that's a strategy for continued engagement without sort of this visceral response of you have offended me or you have hurt me or I'm not willing to go any further with you because you said this bad thing. And so but again, I feel like it's kind of what I thought I learned in third grade, and so it's not very profound, but the bar is low right now.
So one of the big concerns that I have personally about free speech is I feel like we've kind of moved into a new era where the previous big threat that was, I think, governmental and institutional, and people were worried, in the 60s about the schools, about the government. And today I feel like really what I see as the biggest threat is private action that is paradoxically in and of itself free speech. So boycotts or public outcry that leads to firings. And I think there's like an interesting irony to all of this because the marketplace of ideas is supposed to be the gold standard of free speech, and that's why we justify having it at all. But when it becomes an actual economic marketplace of you will lose your job if you say something that offends people, and the thing that is shutting down free speech is free speech used in this particular way. I think a bright spot, at least for me personally, I don't know how other people feel about it, but, Mark Zuckerberg actually saying no, like Peter Thiel will not be kicked off the board, even though he's voting for Trump, which many people do not feel good about. So do we just encourage people to say, okay, you have this free speech right of boycott, of, asking people to be fired, but we just choose not to use it, and maybe the marketplace of ideas is not meant to really be economic in some ways.
So I got two thoughts there. The first is what you named is a real increasing problem with the public forum more generally, and that is that in many places that actually matter, the public forum has been replaced by the private forum. So Facebook is a great example in the online context, right? That is a private actor, and you're right to say that the First Amendment constraints there are far less than they would be in a public space. But there are also offline examples here. So if you remember the Occupy protesters, they ended up in prominent places like Zuccotti Park. Zuccotti Park is a privately owned park. And the reason they ended up there is there was some weird real estate deal 60 years ago in New York City where some landowners deeded these privately held parks to the city, but the parks, under the stipulation, had to remain open 24 hours a day. City parks have curfews. So Occupy wanted to do the tent city. They couldn't do it in the city park, so they had to go to the private park. But now that private park is functionally the public forum. So what do you do in these privately held spaces? I think that's a real policy question that we have to grapple with, especially in the online context when so much of it is privately held. The separate question is this issue of boycotts. And I have a chapter in my book on boycotts. To me, it's the biggest puzzle of all of this because on the one hand, boycotts and collective action are a manifestation of confident pluralism. It's the strength in numbers. It's being able to accomplish in a group what you can't do as an individual. Maybe the clearest example here is in the labor context, right, where the individual employee is not going to be heard by the company and by management, but in labor collective action, you can apply pressure. So there are ways in which forms of collective action and boycotts and strikes and protests are actually very valuable and important to this process. But then when we turn them against other citizens, and it's private force against private force, they create the kinds of problems that you're describing. And if you look at the book, you'll see that I kind of punt in this chapter because I don't know how to resolve it. I do think that when you have historical examples like civil rights boycotts, where you have a political minority protesting against a political majority, there it seems much more sympathetic to the kinds of values and ideas I'm articulating. When you have a political majority boycotting a political minority, even in private, non-regulated spaces, that might create more of a problem. But it's a fundamentally difficult issue.
Just a question about bullying. When does the free speech and the open discourse and the ability to express one's views cross a line that shouldn't be allowed in the classroom or in schools? Because we know bullying is a problem. We know it can lead to some rather devastating results for the individuals who are bullied. And where does truth and the comity come to play when it comes under the withering criticism of being politically correct speech? I mean, I do see, and I do understand what you were saying about that being used as a way to shut down maybe legitimate discourse about the language that's used.
So I think on the second question, we can't have a society, and we can't have a kind of, the kind of society I'm arguing for and the kind of vision of confident pluralism has to allow for big T truth claims, and they have to be allowed in the mix. That doesn't mean they're going to prevail, and it doesn't mean you can't also have relativist claims coming back, but there's in some circles there is a tendency just to shut out completely the big T truth claims, and I think that overreaches, and we're not actually going to reach our deepest differences if we do that, because ultimately most of us, whether we admit it or not, do hold big T truth claims. There are very few people that get on in the world without that at some level. The bullying question in the school setting, and the First Amendment has very distinctive doctrines and applications in secondary education and below. And so in those settings, for reasons of school discipline and safety, you can allow more incursions on speech. But I think once you get to outside of those settings, there are real costs absorbed for the First Amendment that include those kinds of bullying costs. And I don't see how you regulate those under the law outside of very extreme examples. I do think this goes back to my earlier point, we need to do a much better job of actually naming those instances and acknowledging the depth of what that looks like. And I think we just lack, many people in this country, maybe some of us, just lack a basic empathy about people we don't fully know or see as different. And so starting with empathy, if we started with empathy, I think we would have a much better approach to and response to bullying and other issues.
Okay, I think we're out of time. But before I ask you to join me in thanking John, if you have more questions or you're more interested in exploring some of the issues that John talked about or his thoughts about confident pluralism, we asked the bookstore to be here and have a few books on hand. So if anybody wants to do so, you can find those out there. Now, please join me in thanking John for a great conversation.